Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 413, and this time I'm going to talk about this record which came out on Bethlehem Records in 1956. It's by the drummer Stan Levey, this time the drums on me, and this is a first pressing from that year. Stan Levey isn't exactly a name which trips off the tongue these days in jazz conversations, but for those who played with him, he was one of the great modern jazz musicians. The critic Ira Gitler called him everything a good drummer should be. And he wasn't just part of, but actually right at the heart of two major jazz scenes in mid-century America. He was present at the birth of bebop, having a credible claim to be one of the founding drummers of the style, along with Kenny Clarke and Max Roach. He played on 52nd Street with Dizzy, with Bird, with Monk, and then he played in some of the very best post-war big bands, ultimately finding his way out to California, where in the 1950s, along with Shelly Manne, he was at the heart of some of the greatest music produced in that brilliant West Coast jazz scene. He was endlessly adaptable. He could play cool jazz, he played with the big bands, but his sympathies were really with the harder driving bop sound. And this record is an uncompromising bop record, as you might expect of a record which has not only Stan Levey as its leader, but also the wonderful tenor player Dexter Gordon in one of his very, very rare appearances on record in the mid-1950s. Stan Levey was born Adolph Stanley Levey in Philadelphia in April 1926. His dad was a car salesman and a boxing promoter, and young Stan's love of music was only equaled by his interest in boxing, and he excelled, actually, as a young heavyweight in Philadelphia. Adrian! Playing the drums from an early age, he was self-taught and a prodigious talent. Though he was right-handed, he set up his kit as though he were left-handed, with the snare over on the right. In 1942, when Stan was 16, Dizzy Gillespie came to Philadelphia to play a gig. Stan goes to hear the band, and in the intermission, he goes up to talk to Dizzy and asks if he can sit in. And Dizzy says, sure. They're blown away by his playing, and Dizzy is so impressed that he asks Levey to join the band full-time, which Levey does. He drops out of high school. To say that it was unusual for Dizzy Gillespie to hire a white, Jewish 16-year-old kid as his drummer in a field largely dominated by black musicians is an understatement. But Dizzy said, show me a better black drummer and I'll hire him. After playing a little while longer in Philadelphia, young Stan eventually follows Dizzy to New York City, and once he's there, he uses Gillespie's endorsement as his calling card. On 52nd Street, he plays in a combo with Coleman Hawkins and Thelonious Monk. He played with Art Tatum, he played with Ben Webster, he played with Woody Herman. He also played in Oscar Pettiford's group, and he gets to know the drummer Max Roach, and he and Max became friends, and Roach is a huge influence on his style. Bear in mind, he's about 17 years old when this is happening, and the part of his career that I find frankly astonishing is that while all this is happening, he's playing on 52nd Street, he's also maintaining a credible career as a heavyweight boxer, and he appears on cards at Madison Square Garden during this period. But it was short-lived. As he said, every ethnic group had its favorites. For a while I did pretty well as a white Jewish heavyweight, but then I got hurt and it was time to quit. His first recording credits come a year or two into his time in New York in 1944 and early 1945 on a string of 78s made by Barney Biggard, including Sweet Marijuana Brown and Poontang. Most famously, from around this time, in 1945, he was chosen by Charlie Parker to play in his combo, and he stayed on when Bird and Dizzy formed their famous quintet, along with Al Haig and Curly Russell. And that group is generally considered to be the first all-bebop lineup on 52nd Street. And so it's amazing to think that before his 20th birthday, Levey had been a bandmate of Charlie Parker, of Dizzy Gillespie, and Thelonious Monk. That group, with Parker and Gillespie, set the jazz world on its ear on both coasts, on the back of Parker's scintillating playing and Dizzy's own fine trumpet work and compositions. That group went to L.A. in 1945 and played a famous 8-week engagement at Billy Berg's in Hollywood, bringing the bebop sound to the West Coast. And that was also the first racially integrated performance by a band in an historically white L.A. night spot. When that group fell apart, as it did almost inevitably shortly thereafter due to Parker's drug use and general instability, Levey remains in the California jazz orbit. He gets studio work, he gets session work, and he also appears quite frequently for Norman Granz in those tours called Jazz at the Philharmonic. However, like a lot of musicians who played with Bird, Levey fell victim to the common and tragic mistake of emulating Bird's heroin use, and that leads to a year and a half in prison on a federal drug charge which begins sometime in late 1949. Once he was out of jail, he returns, presumably with his tail between his legs, to Philadelphia in 1951, where he starts to rebuild his career, and he forms a quartet with Red Garland, making that group probably the only jazz group that I can think of to feature two former professional prizefighters. It was a pretty good group, too, because the other players were a young Richie Kamuka on tenor and the bassist Nelson Boyd. In 1952, Stan Kenton brings his orchestra through Philadelphia and he goes to hear the quartet. He's so impressed, he snaps up Levey and Kamuka right then and there. That was a great experience for both young players because that was probably the best lineup that Kenton ever had. They toured Europe with him, and Levey eventually ends up leaving Kenton in 1954 and returning to California where he settled for good. As it happens, just as he arrived, his old friend from 52nd Street days, Max Roach, was about to depart the drum chair at the Lighthouse Cafe in Hermosa Beach, where he'd been playing with Howard Rumsey's All-Stars. Max was going off to form his quintet with Clifford Brown. He recommends Stan Levey to Howard Rumsey, and Stan gets the drum chair. And in that role, playing with great musicians and also with well-connected musicians, Levey becomes a fixture on the performing and recording scene on the West Coast. He was incredibly active in the studios during the 1950s. He led quite a few records, although only 3 in his own right, all of them for Bethlehem. 1955 sees the release of Stan Levey Plays the Compositions of Cooper, Holman, and Giuffre. 1956, this record, and in 1957, Bethlehem released Grand Stan. He ends up with over 600 recording credits, and he really is one of those people who played with almost everyone, if you include his time on the East Coast and then all the people he played with in LA. As the 1950s turned over into the 1960s, his recording work tailed off, and I think it's fair to say that Stan Levey's greatest recordings, either as a leader or a sideman, are clustered in the last half of the 1950s, not coincidentally the greatest years of the West Coast jazz scene. He continues to work through the next decade, including a stint with the Tonight Show Orchestra, but he's disillusioned by jazz's decline in the late 60s and early 1970s. He lays his drumsticks down for good in 1973, and he becomes a professional photographer, and he never played music for money again. This record was made on September 27th and 28th, 1955. The producer is Red Clyde. The engineer is Val Valentine. It was made in Los Angeles, very likely in Hollywood, very likely at Radio Recorders, where Clyde preferred to make most of the records that he oversaw, both for Bethlehem and for Mode. Stan Levey's on drums, Leroy Vinegar is on bass, and Lou Levey is on piano, and the horns are Frank Rosolino on trombone, Conte Candoli on trumpet, and the superb Dexter Gordon on tenor sax. As I mentioned, this record is notable for being one of Dexter Gordon's rare 1950s recordings, or rare mid-1950s recordings. Between June 1952 and October 1960, he does not step into the studio at all except in the fall of 1955. He makes 2 records as a leader, one for Bethlehem and one for Dutone, and the third is his appearance here. Side 1 starts with Diggin' for Diz, a Gillespie tune no doubt recorded in tribute to his old band leader and mentor, and it's a rip-roaring start. The next track is another one by a bebop legend. It's Ruby My Dear by Monk, a version that I think does a lot of justice to Monk's angular approach to performance. Next we have Tune Up, which Miles Davis had just released the previous year. On this track we have the best solos on the record by anybody who's not named Dexter Gordon, who really shines throughout. The last track on side 1 is La Chaloupe, which is from an opera by the composer Jacques Offenbach. It's an old tune from France. This is their take on Martial Solal's jazz interpretation of the tune from the year before. And it's kind of an outlier on an LP which for the most part is lusty bop playing. Side 2 starts with the Johnny Mercer tune Day In, Day Out, and this is a joyful jazz standard. It's executed perhaps most inventively by Rosolino. Then we have the only original by any of the performers on this date. It's Stanley the Steamer by Dexter Gordon. This is a track which eventually became one of Dexter's most popular live tunes, and this is its debut on record. The final track is the title track, This Time the Drum's on Me, which is by Oscar Pettiford. This is a rollicking number played at a breakneck bebop pace, which eventually gives way to an exciting and very musical drum solo from Levey. Stan Levey is now nearly forgotten, but there's every reason to resurrect his legacy. His discography is tremendous. I didn't dig into it much in this review, there wasn't time, but you could do a lot worse, for instance, than investigate records like The Arrival of Victor Feldman. All 3 of Stan Levey's records for Bethlehem are very good, and they're stocked with high-quality sidemen, but this one might be the pick of the bunch, and Dexter Gordon is in excellent form. If you like it, and I expect you will, I encourage you to dig further into his catalog, including records where his name might be quite far down the marquee. For me, this record is 4.5 out of 5 stars.